and today I'm going to be doing my September end of the month wrap up. So the month of September was my sci-fi month, which is probably my best month of the year, only topped by my fantasy month, which was July, and July was just amazing. September was also really good. There was tons of books that I absolutely loved in September, especially in like the first half of the month, but I do still have some really great reads for you in the second half of the month. I did kind of fall out of that sci-fi mood towards the end of the month, but I have a little bit more fantasy there for you guys, so I feel like it weighs it out, so you won't get as much sci-fi in this because I have a little bit more of a variety in the second half of the month, but I did pack it in with some fantasy, which I didn't have any fantasy for you guys. And like always, I'm going to start out with my reading stats for the entire month. So in the month of September, I ended up reading 28 books, which is one less than my best month, July, which was 29 books, and significantly more than my worst month, which was August at 8 books. So 28 books in one month is fantastic. I think this year has been really great. I haven't made a 30 book month yet, so I haven't done a 30 and 30. I don't think I'm going to end up doing a 30 and 30, but I don't know, we'll see. But 28 books in one month is fantastic. I do have to say a lot of them were a lot shorter than I typically read. So for example, in July, I read 29 books, but my average page count was like 400 and something pages. My average page count in this month is 351, so like quite a bit lower. But I'm gonna get into like the deep dive of my stats right now. So first of all, for category, this was my sci-fi September, so obviously there's gonna be a lot of sci-fi in here, but I also had a lot of variety this month because I read 1 contemporary, 7 fantasy books, 10 sci-fi books, 3 romance books, 3 thrillers, and 3 classics. And then for star rating, my average star rating was a little bit lower than it typically is. It was at a 4-star rating, which I use quarter stars, so 4.25 stars, 4.5 stars, 4.75 stars tend to be like my highest ranking categories, especially 4.25 stars. But this month, my overall like highest level was my 5-star category. I had 8 5-star books this month. 4 of them were rereads, I will admit that. So like I knew they were gonna be 5-star books, but 4 5-star books that are not rereads is absolutely fantastic. So I had a great reading month. I also had 3 4.75 stars, so like they're really close to 5-star books for me. I did have some lower ratings as well, like down in the 3 and even like into the 2-star range, so that's why my rating overall was brought down quite a bit. But I do think the amount of 5-star and 4.75 star books is really high for me. Then by age range, and this actually really surprised me because all of the books I read this month, all 28 books I read this month were adult books. So I read 0 YA, 0 middle grade, 0 children's books. They were all adult books. So that really surprised me because usually I at least have like 1 YA or 1 middle grade thrown in there. I actually really like middle grade, so I tend to read quite a bit of middle grade, but I don't know, this month I just wasn't feeling it and I went for all adult books. And then for page count, like I mentioned, my average page count was 351 pages. Most of the sci-fi books are in that 300 to 400 page range, so that's why that page range is a little bit higher. And if you can see the chart, like there's a lot of lower page counts in theirs as well, like books under 100 pages and between 100 and 200 pages, so that's why my page count is a lot lower than it typically is. Then I changed my books by source categories up a little bit. I now have 2 libraries that I can go to, one that I can get books through the Libby app, and then my local library, I recently found out, even though they're no longer on the Libby app, they are on Cloud Library, which has some really interesting books on it. Like it has a lot of books that are not on my Libby app, but it has less popular books, if that makes sense. Like it has more obscure books, so if I can't find it on Libby, I might find it on Cloud Libraries. My source stat, I changed it up to match that. So I had 11 books that I physically owned, 7 books I got from the Libby app, 2 books I got from Cloud Library, 4 books were from Audible, 1 from Scribd, and 2 from NetGalley. And then we have our books by medium. I read 4 hardcovers, 7 paperbacks, and 17 audiobooks. I was very heavy on the audiobooks this month. I also found the Audible Plus catalog, which kind of lent to that a little bit. First of all, I'm an auditory learner, so I read better when I listen to audiobooks, and then Audible Plus catalog, like bunch of books for free basically that you can listen to. Yes, I'm going to do it. It's gonna happen. So yeah. Now we're gonna move on to author stats. So I read 14 books by men, 13 by women, and then 1 book that was by multiple authors of different genders. For race, I read 19 books by white authors, 3 by black authors, and 3 by Asian authors, which is not the best ratio, but it's better than some months have been, so I will take that. And then books by country, I read 16 books from the US, 6 from the UK, 3 from Canada, 1 from Sweden, and 1 from China. So for my top 5 authors this month by book, like how many books I read 4 books by Joe Abercrombie, and then 2 books each by Octavia E. Butler, Sylvain Neuval, John Scalzi, and Nora Roberts. Then by publication year, I'll put a little chart on the screen so you guys can check that out. I was really surprised to find that I read 10 new releases that were released in 2020, which really surprised me. I didn't expect that, so 10 new releases, but I also read 3 books that were from the 1800s, which is just a really wide range of years that I ended up reading. And lastly, by publishers, I'll put a little chart on the screen. I read a bunch of different publishers. The only call out here probably is Orbit, which is one of my favorite publishers, and I mean, that's the first Law series. Because I was rereading it in anticipation of The Trouble with Peace, which came out in September, so obviously there's gonna be tons of books by that publisher since they published all the books in that series. So we're gonna start this all off with my DNFs for the month, and I am very sad to say that I ended up DNFing Foundation by Isaac Asimov. It's nothing wrong with this book, like I just was not in the mood for this anymore. I picked this up in like the very last week of the month, and it was right when I had like completely fallen out of like my sci-fi mood, and I really wanted something more slow burn, and this is not slow burn, like at all. I wanted something very character driven and slow burn, and this is not at all character driven. It's very world building driven, if that makes sense. Like I really liked kind of the structure of it, and I do plan on picking this up again in the future. Like I didn't actually like put it as an official DNF, I just put it as an on pause. So I do plan on picking it up at some point again in the future. Whether that's before the end of the year or not, I don't know. But I liked a lot of the things that were happening in here, but I was just not at all in the mood for this type of book again. So I feel really bad that I ended up DNFing Foundation, just because Asimov is an author that I want to read more of. Like after reading The End of Eternity last year, I absolutely loved it so much, but I feel like I just wasn't giving this book the time and attention that it really deserved. And I also heard that like the first 3 books, if you read them together, it really reads like one larger book, and I really wanted to do that. So instead of reading this first book and being disappointed by it, I want to wait till I'm in the right mood for it and read all 3 books at once. So that's my plan for the future with this book. So I do plan on continuing on with it eventually. As of right now, it just didn't work for me. So next we're gonna be talking about my rereads that I read in the second half of September, which I have quite a bit. I reread 3 books in the second half of September. This is of course in anticipation of The Trouble with Peace. It came out in September. I was really excited to get to. Before I got to it, I really wanted to reread the rest of the series first. I didn't reread the standalones, but I did finish my reread of the original series with Before They Are Hanged and The Last Argument of Kings, and I reread the first book in the second trilogy, A Little Hatred. I won't go super in-depth into this just because by now you should know, if you've been watching my channel, that First Law is one of my favorite series of all time. I absolutely love it. And I just wanted to re-solidify like all of those little details in my mind before going into the next book in the series. I have a tendency, like when a new book in like one of my favorite series of all time is coming out, to reread the previous books in the series just so that I solidify everything and really get the experience that I want out of that book for the first time. And it really worked for this because I felt really differently about all 3 of these books actually rereading these, because these were the first time I actually reread all 3 of these. So for Before They Are Hanged, I remember it being one of my favorite books in the First Law trilogy, and I do think it was still really good, but man, The Last Argument of Kings completely blew me away. I think I forgot how much I love The Last Argument of Kings, because I think it's my favorite book in this series. Like legit, like one of my favorite books in this entire series, and one of my favorite books of all time. I absolutely love everything that happens in there. Such good endings to everything that's set up in The Blade itself and Before They Are Hanged. And of course, I also really loved A Little Hatred. It does such a good job of introducing all of the new characters that we get in The Trouble with Peace as well, and I absolutely just love this series so much. Joe Abercrombie does just such a great job of writing characters and very just despicable people that you can't help but loving, because you just know them so well and know how their mind works, and you can't fault them for doing things that you completely expect them to do. So I absolutely love his writing style and everything about this series. So now it's time to talk about all of the books that I read for the first time in the last 2 weeks of September. So as always, I'm going to start with my lowest rated book and work my way up to my highest rated book. I'm not going to talk about any of the books that I read in the first half of September. I did talk about them in my mid-month wrap up though, so if you missed that, I will link that up in the cards for you guys. So the first book that I want to talk about is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. So this is a classic horror novel, maybe thriller novel, probably more like a thriller novel honestly. honestly. I honestly didn't feel very much for this book. I expected a lot out of this book, mind you, because a lot of people seem to really, really love this book. And I also really liked The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, which I read like the beginning of this year, which I feel like is kind of like a retelling of The Turn of the Screw. But I just was not into this at all. Like, I think the story is fine. I just never got attached to it. Like, I never got interested in the story. Like, there was nothing about it that I actually like cared about. So like story-wise, I like, but I did not love the writing. Like there was nothing about the writing that really got me into the story. Like, I was really disappointed by that because I expected to really love this, especially considering I was in a really good like short horror thriller audiobook sort of mood. This one kind of turned me off from those completely. It was like the last one that I read in the month. I was really hoping that it would make me be excited for October, but it didn't happen, and I ended up giving this book 3 stars. So next I want to talk about the Gallaghers of Ardmore series by Nora Roberts. So I read the second and third book in this series in the second half of September, which includes Tears of the Moon and Heart of the Sea. So this is a romance paranormal sort of fantasy series, and it's kind of following these 3 siblings. Aiden, who is kind of the main love interest in the first book in the series, then Sean, who is the main character in the second book, and then their younger sister Darcy, who is kind of the main character of the third book. This series is just so beautifully written. When I was getting like towards the end of the month, I was just in the mood for some like beautiful like atmospheric writing. And while I didn't love this series just because one, it's romance, it's very typically romance, but it goes far enough into fantasy that I kind of expect more from it than just the plain old romance. And it's kind of plain old romance. Like, it's kind of hard to explain because it's kind of about fairies, but it's not. The Prince of the Fairies like makes an appearance in these books, which is kind of weird, and I did not expect that because the first book, it's kind of more magical realism, and that really worked for me when it was more on the magical realism side of the fantasy spectrum. But when it went more towards the fantasy side in Tears of the Moon and just like straight up fantasy in Heart of the Sea, I started thinking of them more as fantasy books, and I expect a little bit more out of my fantasy books. So like, because of that, it didn't necessarily work for me. And also I didn't like the relationship as much in Tears of the Moon. Not because the couple is not as modern, I guess, as like the other 2 couples in the first and the third book, but there was a particular scene that felt a little bit like too much coercion for me to actually like it. But overall, I did enjoy the series. Like, obviously I read both of these like within a couple of days of each other, so like it was definitely really easy to read, and it was fun, and it was like beautiful atmospheric writing, and it was what I was in the mood for at the time, so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But there were other aspects of these books that I didn't love as much. These would be really good beach reads, if that makes sense, and I love that about them. So because of that, I probably will pick up more Nora Roberts books in the future. She is such a beautiful writer, but they're definitely not going to be making like a favorites list of mine anytime soon. I ended up giving Tears of the Moon 3 stars and Heart of the Sea 3.5 stars. So next I want to talk about The Dispatcher and Murder by Other Means by John Scalzi. So this is 2 audiobooks that I picked up from the Audible Plus category. They're both really short. They're like audiobook novellas, basically. I believe the first book, The Dispatcher, was actually a printed book first, but Murder by Other Means is an audio only release, I believe. This series is set in a world in which something happened. No one really knows what it is. No one can die if they're killed by another person. Like, if they're killed by natural causes or if they kill themselves, they can die. But if they're killed by another person, then they just suddenly come back to life. So for example, if you jump off of a cliff, you'll probably die. But if someone pushes you off of the cliff, then you'll show up alive at your home somehow. There's this person called the Dispatcher, and this is what our main character is based off of. So for example, their main character is working out of a hospital at the beginning, and he is sitting in on a surgery, and the surgery goes in a bad way where that patient is probably not gonna live through it. So he's called in to kill the person, and then ostensibly that person will disappear and then wake up in their own house, alive and well. So it's a really interesting concept. I really liked that world building. I thought it was just so creative and interesting, and I really enjoyed the first book, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. I really think it didn't need a sequel though. Like, I didn't think there was that much that needed to be added to it, and I feel like part of the reason why they made the sequel is because the original like novella was really popular on Audible because Zachary Quinto was the narrator, which I think Zachary Quinto is a fantastic actor. Absolutely love him as a narrator. I just thought he was okay. Like, he was fine. He wasn't amazing though, which is what like I would expect from like a celebrity narrator. So I thought it was fine. I enjoyed the audiobooks. I thought the second book was good, but just not as good as the first one, and I enjoyed the first book. So I ended up giving the second book 3.5 stars. It was a fine series. It was short, it was easy to read, and I enjoyed it. So the next book that I want to talk about is Only Human by Sylvain Neuvel. So this book, I'm gonna be honest, was a slight disappointment for me. And the reason for that is because I read Waking Gods in the first half of the month. Absolutely loved Waking Gods so much. I loved it so much. But I think the way these books are written, it didn't lend well to a good finale, if that makes sense. So this is the third book in the Themis Files. Sleeping Giants was a very interesting concept, really unique and creative, and I enjoyed it so much. And then it ends on this major cliffhanger and leaves so many open questions. In Waking Gods, you get all of these answers to those open questions, and you get all of these ideas and thoughts, and then all this action also. Like, so much happens in Waking Gods. And then it ends on another cliffhanger that just leaves so much open that I expected to get like all of this world building and all of this great stuff in Only Human. And while there was a good bit of world building, this was definitely way more character driven than I was expecting, which my minor little tiny complaint for Waking Gods was that I wanted a little bit more character in it. Well, this gave me the character that I wanted, but it didn't give me what I wanted from the Themis Files, which it was action. I wanted creative, interesting resolutions, and I wanted the answers to the questions that I got in Waking Gods. The questions that this book brings up is actually answered in the second book. So like that kind of annoyed me because it was almost repeating itself, but I mean, there is new stuff in this and I did really enjoy it, but like the overall like arc of the story didn't work for me the way the previous two books really worked for me. So because of that, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. I still really love this world. I still really love this series. Probably one of my favorite sci-fi series of all time, but this one was a bit of a disappointment. So the next book I like to talk about is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. So this was the poll book that you guys voted for me to read in September for my Sci-Fi September month. Wow, I enjoyed this a lot more than I was expecting to. I actually watched the movie for this like a while ago. I had wanted to read the books, but for some reason I didn't end up reading the books, and then someone wanted to go see the movie with me, and I went to see the movie, and I was just like, wow, this movie's really bad. But the book is so good. Oh my gosh, I can't believe like I based off of whether I would read a series based off of a movie, because they did such a bad job with the movie compared to the book. The book was fantastic. I absolutely loved the book. There is a certain like cultural aspect to this book that I did not love, and I can't even explain it properly, and I feel like it's not even that irrelevant, but it had to do with kind of like the genetics at the beginning, where it was kind of talking about how they made his parents have a third child because the first boy wasn't good enough because he was too hard, and then the girl wasn't good enough because she was too soft. I don't know if those were the exact words that were being used, but it kind of turned me off from the book at the very beginning. But after I got past that, I absolutely loved this book. It was so much fun, and while I did know the twist at the end, because like I said, I did see the movie, I think it worked really well in the way they did it with this book. Like, it worked so much better than it did in the movie, and I'm really excited to read the next book in this series. I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm not in a sci-fi mood anymore, but I'm definitely hoping to get to it by the end of the year, maybe, if not, definitely sometime next year. But I really enjoyed this, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. So I also want to talk about Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. This book is the sequel to Parable of the Sower, which I read in the first half of the month. It was actually my favorite book that I read in the first half of the month. I loved it so much. This is like a near future dystopian, so kind of along the same strain as like 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World, and The Handmaid's Tale, kind of like on that same strain. But unlike all of those, which I just kind of like, I absolutely loved Parable of the Sower. I thought it was done so well, and Octavia E. Butler is just way ahead of her time. In the first book in this series, the president's name was Donner, and in the second book, different president wants to make America great again, because of course he does. And I absolutely love that she can kind of almost predict these sort of things in ways that like I didn't expect. I do think we're not quite to the level of just like dystopianness that this book is, but I can totally see our country going that way if it continues on its current path. And it really worked for me in Parable of the Sower. It didn't work for me as well in Parable of the Talents, and I think part of it was just the mother-daughter relationship in this book. I can completely understand how it turned out the way it did. Like, I can completely understand it, but I'm a very optimistic person, and Butler writes really dark books, and this book just bummed me out so much. Kind of the way The Stand by Stephen King just completely bummed me out when I decided to read it back in, like, I want to say it was was March, right when the whole pandemic thing started happening. That book, because it's about a pandemic flu destroying the world as we know it, and it was just so realistic, it really bummed me out, even though I knew it was brilliant. And that's kind of how I feel about Parable of the Talents. Like, I know this book is brilliant, but while the first book in the series like made me really excited about just like the world building and the characters and all of that, this book kind of just bummed me out about it. So I ended up giving it 4 stars because of that, but I still think it's an absolutely brilliant book that everyone should read. And probably one of my favorite sci-fi books that I read all month has to be The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu. Oh my gosh, this book was so fantastic, you guys. So this is the sequel to The Three Probably Problems. So this is the second book in the Remembrance of Earth's Path series. I don't even know how to explain this book because it's so unique and interesting, and like it follows a main character, but it also follows multiple main characters. And the way this book is structured, you're completely in the scene and understanding what's going on and thinking it's really cool. But like for like the first half of this book, it's just like scene after scene where you're just kind of like, well, this scene is really interesting and I'm really intrigued by it and I really love what's going on. But how does this connect to all of the other scenes? Like, how does this connect to the story as a whole? But when you get to it at the end, oh my gosh, I loved it so much. And just kind of the things that it brings up and just the metaphor of the dark forest and what it is, like, just gave me goosebumps when that was revealed because it was so good. I absolutely love this book so much, and I cannot wait to read the next book in the series. I actually did pick up the next book in the series, but like Foundation, I was just not in the mood for sci-fi anymore, and I wanted to really give my time and attention to that book, so I decided to not read it yet. But as soon as I'm in a sci-fi mood again, that is the next book that I'm going to be picking up because this was absolutely fantastic. Loved it so much. I definitely thought this was going to be like my favorite book of the month. There's a couple more here for you guys. Even so, I absolutely love this, and I gave this 4.75 stars. So now we're getting to some of my favorite books that I read in the month, and probably on my favorite books of the year, and definitely in that category, I have to talk about Jade War by Fonda Lee. Oh my gosh, I love this book so much, you guys. Like, so much. Like, once I got into this book, like more than the first couple of chapters, I could not put it down. Like, I was not in the mood for fantasy at all. Like, not in the mood for it at all. But because this book was so good, I had to read it. I absolutely loved everything about this book. I love the family in this book. I love the family dynamics. I love all of like the complex relationships that are in this book. I love the characters in this book so much. Like, there's this one character from the first book. You guys might know him if you've read this book, Hilo. In the first book, I didn't think he was going to amount to much. And I was thinking like, man, all the other characters are going to like take over and be like more prominent characters than Hilo is. And I love Hilo in the first book. Like, I loved him because he's just like this really unlikable character, but in a way that makes you absolutely love him. And man, I absolutely loved him in this book. He makes some of the worst choices ever, but because you understand exactly where that's coming from and you see it happening miles away, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is gonna happen. It's like watching a train wreck. Like, it's gonna be horrible, and you know it's gonna be horrible, but you can't look away because it's just such a disaster. Like, you have to see what's gonna happen. And I loved every second of this book because of that. Literally, I don't have a bad thing to say about this book. Jade City was fantastic. First book in the series, loved it. Jade War, 10 times the book Jade City was. I feel like that's like my mantra this year, is just like the sequels are always better. And I absolutely cannot wait for Jade Legacy to come out next year. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for it. Probably one of my most anticipated reads of next year, and I absolutely love this, and of course I gave it 5 stars. So in any other month, Jade War would have been my favorite book of the month because it's just an absolutely fantastic book. But this month, The Trouble with Peace came out, and this is my most anticipated read of the year, and I absolutely loved it so much. You guys have no idea how much I love this book. It was definitely better than A Little Hatred, and I flipped out when I read A Little Hatred. I absolutely loved it. So you guys can just imagine how much more I loved this book. There's so many things that happen, and I loved every second of it. Unlike A Little Hatred, where the first time I read it, I was just really stuck on like one character and really loved it. I'm really glad I reread A Little Hatred and got to know the other characters more because I loved all of them in this book. The 4 like main characters, Rika, Leo Dan Brock, Orso, Savine Dan Glokta, like all of them I absolutely love. Savine is still my favorite because Glokta, but like there were sections where like there was this one scene towards the end that was in Savine's point of view that I was just like, oh my gosh, I really wish this was an Orso's point of view right now, because there's just so much that happens. You want to be in all of these people's heads because they're all so like unique and interesting, and you want to see how they're reacting. And I'm like never like that. I never want to be in the characters' heads, but I just love them so much, and I love all of the things that are happening in here. here. I absolutely love this. The politics in this are fantastic. I absolutely love the politics in this. And my only thing going out of this one is, who's the owl? If you guys have read this series and you have an answer to that, let me know in the comments. Who do you think the owl is? Oh, and I forgot to mention, I gave this book 5 stars because of course I did. So if you've read any of these books, let me know down in the comments because I would love to discuss with you guys. I post videos on Sundays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, so consider subscribing. And if you'd like to be notified as soon as I upload, you can click that little bell icon. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up to support my channel. All social media links are in the description down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.